Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grow with Inbound 2021. It's great to be here. Thank you for everybody in attendance. My name is Matthew Creswick. I'm the CMO here at Hubble Digital, based in Singapore, where my brilliant guest, David Fallarme, is also based. So, Grow with Inbound 21. This is session number 2. We've just had a great session with Irina Chichkina from Tunes in Singapore. We've also got a ton of sessions throughout the day today that you should stick around for. We'll be interviewing Hubspot's new CEO, Yamini Rangan. We'll be speaking with Christian Kinnear, Gregor Hufenreiter, Gail Wheaton, Phoebe Scott from Addison Young. There's a great deal of content coming your way throughout the day and into some of your evenings. But today, right here, right now, David and I are here to talk about lead gen, to talk about demand gen, to talk about 2022, what your marketing setup looks like, how do you get people to love your brand, to trust your brand, and ultimately use marketing as a key driver for business growth. So David, who's joining me, has over 15 years of experience across marketing, across product marketing, content marketing, inbound marketing. David headed up HubSpot's Asia marketing team. He also runs his own APAC marketing roundtable community, which I personally get a lot of value for on a daily basis. He's now marketing director at On Deck, a platform that builds and drives top talent to advance their career through community. And community will be certainly something that David and I will be chatting about in the very near future. So, David, welcome to Grow with Inbound 2021.
Matthew, so good to see you. It's been a while. We used to catch up for coffee, and now we're catching up virtually, as is the trend in 2021, but it's good to see you. It's good to be here.
It's good to see you, David. As you said, it seems like a while since I saw you open HubSpot's Grow event at Marina Bay Sands in Singapore in October 19. And the idea of having how many people? 5,000-10,000 people in one room seems a bit mad.
There's a lot.
Seems a bit mad. Okay, well, David, thank you for joining us. We're going to start by taking things back a little bit in time, kind of zooming out around the idea of lead generation. Lead generation didn't start when the internet came about, and it certainly didn't start, until we had these things called marketing automation tools, for example. Wide question, but what is your view on the history of lead generation? Over the last, maybe 50, 60 years through to where we are today.
I love talking about this topic because I've definitely been in a situation where I go to a conference, in person or virtual, then I attend a session that is like, oh my God, mind blowing. Some guy said that he grew his company 300% by doing this one tactic. So he gave a case study around this thing, or listen to somebody talk about how she was able to revolutionize her marketing by doing this one thing. And so I'll jot those notes down furiously. And then, I go home and I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna get promoted. This is gonna be the best. Then when I do those things in my company, it doesn't work out. And I'm like, how come that person said this thing was gonna work and I did, it didn't work? And so this happened enough times that I wanted to really understand the principles of what the right context is. Why marketing automation? Why lead generation? Why am I running ads on LinkedIn? Like, why do any of this stuff, right? And so it took me down this rabbit hole of thinking about the history of demand generation and the history of lead generation. And the framework I'm about to share has helped me make sense of all the best practices I hear today. And I understand why people are saying the things that they're saying, like, hey, you should ungate all of your ebooks, or you should invest in community, you should have a podcast. Like, why are they saying that? So this framework helped me understand that. But also I think it's going to help me understand the next 3 to 5 years of marketing, because it's all just this trend of centralization to decentralization. Okay, so what in the world do I mean by that? Let's go back to the 50s, where I would say the information in a marketplace was really stored within companies. Companies had all the information. If it's very possible that if you just had never heard of a product because a company didn't send a salesperson to your door, or because they didn't run an event near your house, or they didn't send a direct mailer to you, it's possible you just never hear about that thing. And so because everything was stored within the company, they had all the information power, right? That started slowly changing with the rise of broadcast mediums like TV, radio, and billboards and things like this, right? Where in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this is like the rise of Mad Men. So that era where the information starts to go away from just the companies, but now into the channel, the media channel, where, if you are advertising a new detergent, like we all still know Mr. Clean because of those crazy ads in the 60s and 70s, 80s, and all those brands that were built. And so information started going from the company down into the broadcast channels. And this continued for a long time, from the 60s to 70s, maybe even down to the 90s. And this is really the rise of trade magazines, niche conferences. So you could imagine that in the early days of Silicon Valley in the 60s and 70s, if you didn't read the right magazine, or if you didn't know about the right company, you could just never know about something. But in the 90s, there's so many different trade magazines. There's so many different publications that you can start to consume. Now you can get up to speed just through the channel. You don't have to rely on the company. What started happening in the 2000s and 2010s is social media became a thing. So information continues to decentralize, where a centralized company, then the broadcast channels, and now it's communities and social media and information between people, where as opposed to us learning only from Wired magazine about what the latest things are, we'll Google on our own and find a blog post review on someone, or we'll go to LinkedIn, or we'll go through the newsfeed. And that, for many of us, is the primary way of us discovering information, or listening to podcasts, because sometimes I'd rather listen to somebody who is in the nuts and bolts of things and the weeds of things, as opposed to maybe somebody just doing a review from a third-party perspective. And so what that means for lead generation, so that brings us to the present day, is if you are living in a world where your lead generation and demand gen is in this mode of, we just broadcast information to our customers. So we're going to keep things behind a form. And if you don't want to fill in the form, like, it's too bad for you. If you're stuck in that mode, then you're missing out on this new wave of how information is being shared, which is between people. So people don't need to download your form. They'll just ask a friend in their community, or they'll go to a review site like G2, or they'll just Google and look for reviews. So it's less and less the case where you have all the information, and more the case where communities have the information, and people are relying on their peers and influencers to get information. And so as a company, if you're not having a stake in the ground, or if you're not having any investment in communities, in ways to start conversations between people, then you're going to continue to lose market share. You're going to start to lose relevance, and that's going to hurt you in the short term, but definitely over the long term.
Amazing, thank you, David. What a history of lead gen that was. But I guess maybe just to focus. So I'd be surprised if there's companies still stuck in the kind of 60s and 70s tactics of outbound sales brochures, broadcast media. Certainly, it still takes place, but it's a percentage of their marketing budget and spend rather than 100% of their budget and spend. Perhaps if we go a little bit more granular to the last decade, for example. So, David, you worked for 4 or 5 years as head of marketing in Asia for HubSpot. And if I look back at kind of HubSpot over the last 10, 15 years, they basically wrote the script for how to build a inbound marketing machine, right? So build a content machine, focus on SEO, focus on blogs, pillar pages, topic clusters, convert leads really early in their sales cycle through, as you said, ebooks, white papers, conversion tools like Website Grader, and then basically build a database of people and nurture them to a point where they book a demo, get a free trial, or basically speak to a salesperson and become a customer. I guess, your experience being in HubSpot throughout that play, obviously HubSpot share price says they did really well, and it worked, but maybe just your experience of being inside of that rather than kind of an external person looking in.
Yeah, so just 2 points on that. One is that I'm not saying that you should totally turn off all of your gated ebooks. All I'm saying is that there's a shift to a situation where that needs to be less of your marketing mix. So those still have room. And if it's working for you, kind of like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But just know that that's going to become less and less important over time. Just as one could argue that trade show booths, you could still do them. But in terms of, is that the best use of your incremental marketing spend? Less and less true that that's the case for everyone. So what did I see at HubSpot? And I think the most inspiring thing I saw there is how committed the company is at adding value over the long term. Like there was this thing that was said over and over whenever I was in a meeting discussing the content strategy, which is create value before you capture value, which sounds simple, makes total sense, but it's very hard to do practically speaking. So what does that look like practically? At the beginning of COVID, 2020 March, sometimes it feels like we're still in 2020 March, depending on where you are in the world, but actual 2020 March, one of the decisions made in the marketing team was, hey, we're going to release as much information as we can to help people through this time. And we are not going to gate any information. It's going to take a ton of work because we need to do all sorts of data crunching in the background. We actually need to clear a couple of legal hurdles so we can release this data. But then in the end, we had this giant campaign called Adapt 2020 that helped people just make sense of what was happening. There was no way you could opt into that. Like you could just sign up, or you could just get information without signing up. But that's a great example of a company really being committed to this idea of get people to talk within communities about how helpful HubSpot is from a place of authenticity and a really genuine place of wanting to help. And then that mindset allows them to, whenever there is a problem that HubSpot can solve, you'll think of them first. You'll think of them, oh, they helped me. I had a marketing problem, I had a sales problem. They helped me. They were very helpful. And so I'm going to go to them whenever I do have a problem that they could solve. So that's an example of how that plays out practically. It's making sure that your content adds value and not necessarily thinking that just because, oh, we spent so much time on this infographic, we spent so much time on this report, we must gate it. That shouldn't always be the instinct. And I know it's very hard not to do that because you spent so much time. And of course, you want to give some leads to your sales team. But again, that can still work, but just know that it's going to be less and less effective over time because the market has moved on. The marketplace in terms of information and how that's being delivered is now going more to the community. People are sharing more amongst each other as opposed to relying on vendors to tell them how the world works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, David, that's a mindset shift as well as being, a tactic shift, right? In the sense of, yes, you could just ungate a piece of content tactically and then suddenly it's open on your website that anyone can get to it. But it's kind of the mindset around it, which is the important thing of providing value rather than, just trying to capture email addresses, right?
Yeah, this is really hard for a lot of companies because it kind of doesn't make sense. It's like we spend all this time doing it and we want to exchange the value we created for a contact. And to be fair, a lot of companies have been teaching this. Like HubSpot is one of those companies that said, like, hey, if you're going to write something, put it behind a form and then drip people. And then at the end of that, then a salesperson will call them. That is still going to work. All I'm saying is it's going to be less effective over time.
Yeah. Okay. And so I guess those tactics of, as you just referenced, they're not going away. No one's sitting here saying don't do it at all. It's old. It's dead, etc. And I'm kind of putting blogging and kind of SEO in the same bucket as this. But if you think about kind of ungating content becoming more and more popular, the amount of content out there today, I searched this earlier, and according to the first thing that came up on Google, there's 4.4 million blog posts published every day online.
Not surprising.
And it just kind of shows the competitiveness of you trying to rank for competitive keywords is just mad. So I guess if we kind of look forward, perhaps 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, what do you see as kind of like the next play? If you imagine you take the kind of SEO, blog, topic cluster, convert people via ebooks and gated content. You've obviously touched upon kind of community podcasts and stuff. What do you see as that next play over time?
Yeah, I think it's two things. One is we're hearing a lot about product-led growth. So that really just is because there's so much content, like you said, 4.4 or whatever the stat is. I'm probably higher if you count all the written content on LinkedIn, like Twitter. And I mean, is that a blog? Anyway, or like newsletters, right? There's just so much content out there. And I think what that has produced is kind of like a content inflation. So every piece of content is worth less. And so if you're thinking that you're going to exchange your information for content, the content needs to be really, really good. So people are still willing to do that if it's really, really good. And so you can't get away with saying like top 10 tips to do this and put that behind a form. It has to be really good for people to want to download your slide deck or whatever. So I think that's the first thing I would think of. And product-led growth is related to that, which is saying, hey, instead of trying to convince you and then drip email you and then have a SDR call you, just get into the product and try to understand it on your own. And so the onus becomes more on the company to make sure that they're doing their best, that their experience is really good. So in a way, leads become users, and that's a whole different paradigm. But a lot of companies, including HubSpot, have found that to be much more efficient, because instead of spending all this time kind of massaging people to think about marketing automation or CRM in a certain way, we'll just show you the product. You're already interested. So we'll educate you as you are getting value from the product. It's kind of related to the capture value after you create value situation, right? And the second thing is to divorce yourself from this idea of the only way to measure marketing is the contact database and how that's growing. So lead generation is probably one of the top goals that marketers have. It's like other teams, especially if there's a sales leader attached to the marketing team, that's saying, hey, if you're not growing your leads database, then you're not doing your job as a marketer. Where I think, especially the higher ticket you go, we are seeing a trend in marketing and sales teams working more together. And what really matters at the end of the day is the pipeline that they generate together, as opposed to marketing generating X leads and then throwing them over a fence and sales doing something with that. Where, HubSpot has moved in this direction as well, where like sales and CRM they use the same UI. So a marketer can go into the sales dashboard and understand what's going on with their leads. And a salesperson can go into what the marketing looks at every day and understand the journey of their customers, right? So sales and marketing working together. And that frees up marketing from just thinking about leads and like running ebooks, throwing ads on LinkedIn and Facebook, and driving a webinar every month. Like I was talking to somebody last summer who was saying, hey, we can't do trade shows anymore. So we started doing 4 webinars a month. And I'm like, who is signing up for these webinars? So you multiply that one person times every marketing team in the universe. And it's one of the reasons why everybody had webinar fatigue last year. So if it frees you away from doing lead gen as you have been thinking about it over the last little while, that frees you up to do a lot of real demand generation, like actually generating interest in your category, actually educating people about how your service works or your product works. And that leads to things like podcasts. So you would create a podcast that helps educate your buyers well before they get into your database, or you invest in communities. Maybe you start a community on your own, or you go into an existing community. There's a ton of marketing communities out there that you could find your way into if you sell to MarTech vendors, as an example. And HubSpot has started to do this along with a lot of other companies. There's actually a lot of companies now that have started meme pages on Instagram as their way to drive top of the funnel awareness, which is just a crazy sentence if you think about it. Like if you said that 5 years ago, you'd be like, what are you talking about? I'll be doing most of my marketing on Instagram. But look it up. It's true. Like the company Dooly, look up Dooly, Dooly. Look up what they're doing on Instagram, and it's genius. So that's an example of how lead demand generation looks like in this new world of decentralized information, where social media is really the way that people are educating each other. The scary part is it doesn't show up neatly on a dashboard that says, hey, we generated this many leads this month. And you can't really track it. Like if I'm scrolling Instagram on my phone and I learn about Dooly while I'm walking home from the grocery store, and then 2 weeks later, I Google Dooly and I type in, something related to them, then I opt in on their website, it's not going to show up that Instagram was the first touch. It's going to show up that I organic search, right? And so that's just very scary for a lot of people. But that's how marketing is working these days. Attribution is getting harder and harder because multi-device and the complex attribution reality that we live in. So I think that's what it looks like. So just to recap, the value of content needs to go way up. If you want to keep playing that lead generation game, you can't just get away with what you've been doing for the last 5 years. It's going to need to go up. And whether that means content needs to get better, or you need to provide some kind of product-led experience where people get into the product. And then the second thought to that is, how can you create real demand generation programs that aren't necessarily tied to trading information for a contact email, but just educating the market, knowing where they are, whether that's a blog, community, email, Instagram, meme page, YouTube, and just being there and helping educate them well before they opt into your website.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so David, you touched a couple of times on the idea of decentralization, which I think is a really interesting thing to focus on here, because I think in lots of other industries, you're kind of seeing this at the moment. It's not just the marketing industry that is seeing decentralization at the moment. Maybe an example kind of similar to what you referenced, David. People are making big decisions on maybe a piece of SaaS that they're purchasing for their company or something within something like a Facebook group or a LinkedIn thread or a Discord channel, as opposed to sitting there and looking at HubSpot's blog or Salesforce's blog or Microsoft Dynamics blog, for example. I guess how do you see that idea of decentralization kind of playing longer term? I guess how can marketing learn from other industries, but also how can kind of marketing people, that in my head it's quite hard for me to say, okay, well let's just build a community, because in my head we still own the community. It's still going to be biased from if we create a community. So how could a company get into communities in an unbiased fashion?
Yeah. I like what you mentioned there about how this is not just a marketing trend. So for those of you who are into crypto, Web3, this is a industry agnostic trend that's happening. So decentralized finance is a thing because of blockchain technology and crypto. Bitcoin itself is kind of a decentralized asset. We don't need to go too deep into that world because I could probably keep going on that for a while. But just know that I'm not talking about something that is strictly related to marketing, and you should realize that this is a trend happening everywhere. Increasing access to the internet worldwide, not just in Western-speaking countries, but worldwide. Different regions developing their own version of internet, and then different best practices coming around the world. Thinking about increased access. So one of the things that excites me being seated in APAC is all these Southeast Asian and Indian companies IPOing and making tons of money, and realizing that there's billions of users in this side of the world. So decentralization is a trend agnostic to industry. And once you start watching for it, you notice it everywhere. And then you start to understand how you can recognize patterns and then bring those into your professional life. So an example of that is, communities within this crypto space. It's huge. It is the way that everything gets done. So I'm going to go a tiny bit into the crypto rabbit hole here. So there's something called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. And there was a DAO. They're not really a company. There was a decentralized autonomous organization that recently tried to buy the US Constitution for $47 million, which is, again, one of those insane sentences that 5 years ago would not have made any sense. And yet it came together in 2 weeks. So all these strangers all around the world contributed $50 million to buy the US Constitution. And how did that happen? That happened through communities. That happened through a chat platform called Discord, which some people might know if they're into the gaming and crypto space. And so this is similar to what's happening. This behavior is happening across all industries, right? But particularly in tech, just because we're so close to Slack. I heard your Slack notifications there. So that's an example of us just being in Slack all the time. What can marketers do to actually take advantage of this? I think, I have two concrete things you can actually do. One is to start thinking of yourself as a media company as opposed to just a marketing organization. This is something that HubSpot did extremely well. If you Google anything remotely related to marketing or sales, you're going to find some HubSpot blog post or some HubSpot YouTube channel or HubSpot podcast on it, just because they have done such a good job of making sure that people just think about them related to business and marketing. And one of the ways they did this is, instead of launching more and more podcasts, HubSpot actually bought and created a podcast network. So they bought a media company called The Hustle, and then they created a series of podcasts. They linked together all these existing podcasts into a media network. That is going to be impossible to track. It's not going to show up in a CRM neatly, but that's an example of how you need to rearrange your brain to survive in this new world of decentralized communities. So as a marketing organization, think about how you can create a media team that makes sense for your company, your budget, and your industry. The first point of entry for a lot of companies is, let's start a podcast, because you need to create that content creation muscle. And podcasts are great because you get to talk to your target customer all the time. You get to refine your understanding of your ICP, and then you can repurpose that content from an audio conversation into a blog post, into social, into YouTube, into ebooks, into webinars. So the first recommendation I have is maybe start a podcast or start a YouTube show, a LinkedIn live series, whatever makes sense for your company and your industry. And the second thing is to start getting involved into communities. So whether that means you start your own community, because some industries don't have like large go-to communities. I was talking to somebody recently who was in the legal industry, and it's one of those industries that's very cliquish. Like people don't really want to meet people broadly. And so their company, I believe they're a SaaS company, they started their own community for lawyers. The important part here is they did not make it a vendor narrative. Like they didn't say, hey, this is the community and we're going to be talking about our software here. It's generally just getting people together and authentically trying to create a community to share best practices and get better at each other's jobs. So they do webinars, they do programming that brings in industry experts, and they don't pitch their software at all. But that allows you to start organically getting into people's minds and starting conversations with you being involved in some value-adding way. So to recap, media organization, usually practically what that means is podcast or YouTube show, because then you can repurpose it. And the second thing is you need to start evaluating what involvement in communities look like, whether that is starting your own community or researching what's out there, because there's a lot, and then finding ways you can add value to that community.
Awesome. Now, David, I guess maybe just to bring together that idea of kind of community, podcast, video with the idea around decentralization. You referenced before that, there's going to be aspects of this which are really hard to track. So, for example, in a marketing leader these days is going to be chased like hell from their management to have a beautiful attribution report, which shows, out of all of our customers, what's come from organic, what's come from paid, what's come from social, what's come from events, etc., etc. I think what we're talking about here is marketing or some aspects of marketing and marketing tactics becoming a lot less trackable, right? So, it's, as you said, somebody might listen to 25 of your podcasts, learn about your product, build trust with your business and your brand, go to their laptop and type in your company name and turn up as direct traffic or organic search. And somebody sits there, in the SEO team and says, brilliant, we're doing a great job.
Yeah, that was our win. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's the 25 hours of podcasts they listen to. Now, kind of, back onto the mindset shift. That's a hard thing for somebody maybe to get their head around when they're sitting there thinking, well, I've got to report back to my board next month on attribution. So, I guess what are your thoughts on those aspects being a lot less trackable around kind of people who work in marketing almost having to accept that there's going to be elements here that, we can't prove ROI on?
It's tough. That's a tough one. And I don't know if I have the best answer for it that works for every company. I think there's a few things in there though. One is, as a marketer, if you buy into this idea, and it's not my idea, by the way, this is like, again, agnostic to the industry. If you believe in this trend and you believe that it impacts your company in some meaningful way, then it's up to you to lead that narrative inside your company. So get educated on it, develop a strong opinion on it, and lead that narrative and educate across, up and down, of how marketing is supposed to work, as opposed to relying on best practices from the industry. Like, what does it look like for you? So that's the first thing I would say is if you really believe this is the way to go, then you have to lead that charge. And that's eventually going to take you down this idea of moving the company away from last generation measurement and attribution tactics. If you really, the thing with attribution reporting is it doesn't hold up to a magnifying glass. If you really, really think about it, for example, like I personally believe, a lot of people disagree with me, but I personally believe that branded search is kind of a scam, like branded SEM, like somebody typing in your company's brand and then you bidding on that in Google AdWords and you're paying like $20 a click, even though somebody typed in your brand name. Like, I feel like that's a scam. It doesn't hold up to any logic. Somebody typed in HubSpot. They're looking for HubSpot. And so they're not necessarily going to click to our competitors because they had HubSpot. Anyway, so that's one example of, if you are reliant on the attribution model as your basis for making every marketing decision, I would encourage you to just really inspect that and think about how it holds up under scrutiny, right? So that leads you down into, okay, well, how should I be measuring it? This goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where if you're a B2B company especially, your way of measuring marketing success is not going to be just in the marketing silo itself, but as a revenue team with sales. So at the end of the day, what you're trying to drive is pipeline for sales, or meetings booked or deals closed, right? So that should be a goal that marketing plugs into, as opposed to the marketing goal being we drove this many leads, or we drove this many pricing page visits, or this many MQLs, right? So I think that mindset needs to start happening. That shift needs to start happening, where the way you should measure marketing is through some kind of revenue goal that's closer to the closed one that sales is accountable to, and then having that become the North Star that marketing works backward from. And just a side note on something you said there, where I think if the leadership is interrogating, hey, how much did organic search return? How much did paid podcast? If you're going down to that granular level of detail, then I would say the marketing team and the lead marketer is not doing a great job of explaining and setting the framework for how marketing is supposed to work. Because as a marketing leader, you're supposed to have the narrative, and you're supposed to be the one saying, marketing as a function should be delivering these outcomes. It is not up to the CEO or the CFO to be saying, hey, the paid marketing campaign for this one wasn't as good as this one. Like, that is just the wrong level of granularity for them to get into. That tells me that the marketing leader has not done their job in educating the firm, but also making sure that they are communicating the right metrics that they should be gold on.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. David, time is flying by as we chat here. I guess thinking on a practical level, there's going to be a lot of people watching this in marketing positions looking to build out marketing plans for 2022. With obviously a few weeks left of this year. I guess I'm interested in what your recommendations would be on building a marketing plan for next year. And this is going to be different for every single business out there, but kind of going back to the idea of, the blogs, ebooks, early sales cycle conversions kind of becoming perhaps a little bit less effective, and this move to community, social, podcast, video, audio becoming, how people research products and purchases these days.
Yeah.
Those two things, how does that affect perhaps how you would plan a marketing budget and a marketing strategy kind of going into 2022?
Yeah. I think the good news is the fundamentals are the same. So the advice that I would share that's helped me a lot is always make sure you understand the media information diet of your target customer. And that goes into like almost interviews with your ICP. So one of the things that was very helpful during my time at HubSpot is we would always check in on, hey, is our understanding of the target persona correct? How is it changing? How has it changed 1 year ago when we ran a persona exercise? So one of the things I did was I would sit in with the sales teams or listen to the recorded calls and just make sure that my sense was correct. So one advice I would give is, if you're not doing, let's call it once a month check-in with your target persona and stress testing it around what's actually happening in the marketplace, then that's a great place for you to start. And it helps inform your media spend. Like, where should you be spending your money? To give you an example, a lot of B2B companies think that the way to reach B2B buyers is on LinkedIn, because B2B is LinkedIn, like B2 LinkedIn, B2B. So I'm going to spend all my money on LinkedIn. And the surprising thing is you should actually be spending a lot of your money on Facebook and Instagram as well, because guess what? A CMO does not stop being a CMO just because they open Instagram. Like, they're still a CMO. You can still reach them through Instagram. One of the most impactful campaigns we did at HubSpot was actually advertised on Facebook and Instagram, and we didn't do as much on it on LinkedIn. And that insight happened because we were always trying to stay close to who our target customer is. And when you do that, you tend to check your assumptions, you learn new things, you understand how people are changing their media consumption, and therefore how you can advise to change your media mix in where you invest in the following years. So that's what I would say.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I mean, fantastic example. I was in a Facebook group the other day, and I shared this with our sales team at Hubble Digital, but there was somebody literally in the Facebook group asking for recommendations on should they onboard HubSpot, Marketo, or Pardot. I guess hearing you talk about getting close to your ICP, where I see a lot of companies and a lot of marketing people kind of, in terms of a persona or an ICP, sit down with their sales team and kind of create this document of assumptions of this is where they consume their information, this is their challenge, this is their pain point. When actually kind of, there's a ton more insights you can gain from things like community. There was 25 comments within that Facebook thread around this person trying to buy a product. So no, interesting to hear you talk about that. So as we kind of move,
that's a great point. And I just want to say that not everybody's in MarTech, right? So you should go to wherever your ICP, what social media platform they use, and understand who the influencers are in that niche, and then follow them, respond to their comments, and understand how the narrative is shifting. So just to your point around communities being an important part, make sure you know who the influencers are, you respond to their comments, or you have them some kind of relationship with them, even if it's just you're listening to their broadcast. And that's going to help you in understanding how your ICP's mindset is changing.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess, David, just kind of sticking on that point you referenced around, especially kind of at HubSpot and no doubt at On Deck now, around you doing things like listening to sales calls, having calls with, an ICP customer. What advice would you give to people who kind of maybe feel like they're not as close to their customers as they should be, and they are doing things like making assumptions, assuming something, which means that you post on LinkedIn or you create a piece of content?
Yeah, I don't know. Just go talk to your customer. Just find your customer and go talk to them. So you have your best customers, presumably in some kind of CRM. So you should talk to the ones that are very happy with you and understand, what's going on in the world. You should talk to people or listen to the calls or read the notes of people who have just joined and understand why they joined you and why they chose you for the competition. So understanding the behavioral triggers is extremely important. And I don't know how else to do that other than like listening to customers, talking to prospects, shadowing calls, especially in B2B, right? In B2C, it's a tiny bit trickier because there's not necessarily a human touch point there, but there's still a ton of ways you can do it. You can talk to customers, you can still email customers, you can still listen to the podcast they listen to, you can consume the content they consume. So there's a lot of ways to do it. It's just a matter of making sure it's a priority.
Yeah, I guess it's a very straightforward answer, but perhaps some people need to spend a lot more time and, as you referenced, priority doing it.
It's weird because you think, hey, I'm the marketing person. Like, I know what my customers. What is this guy saying? I don't know my customer. Like, it changes. Is all I'm saying. And you just need to be on top of that. And it changes sometimes faster than you think.
Yeah. Okay. So David, this time has absolutely flown. In the last session with Arena, I referenced that at the end of each session, we are asking each person for one piece of key advice they could give to, in your sense, a marketing director for, their career moving into 2022. So anyone who's listening, what advice would you give them going into 2022 on how to kind of develop and progress their career in marketing?
Yeah, don't just listen to marketing people. I think the biggest, marketing people always talk about the same stuff, MQLs, demand gen. Sometimes it gets kind of a bit crazy. And so I would actually recommend reading finance people and listening to finance influencers. So before you think I'm crazy, I believe that all business problems are really just resource allocation problems. Where should I invest? How should I spend my time? Where should I put this headcount? And so if you think about it, who else better to learn from than people who are investing on other people's capital, allocating huge sums of capital, and who have trained their ways of thinking about risk, thinking their ways of portfolio diversification and management. So I've learned a lot from reading finance people. So don't just read from marketing people, read across different industries, because you're going to find patterns that will be useful to your day-to-day work. If you wanted to pick an industry in particular, I suggest finance.
Amazing. I think I could do with that advice, David, the amount of marketing content I consume. Okay, awesome. Well, look, I think, sadly, I think we're kind of coming to the end of the session. David, thank you so much for joining us today. Big thank you to everyone who is still on the line as well and has stayed to the end of the session. Next up, our Hubble Digital CEO, Bob Dearsley, will be speaking with Gregor Hufenreiter from HubSpot in Germany, all around HubSpot's new EU data center, the increasing importance of information technology. So please do stay on the line for that in around 20 minutes time. But David, again, big thank you from everyone at Hubble, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. It's good to see you again. Hopefully we can catch up in person soon.
Absolutely. Good to see you, David.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks.